Hey class, today we're going to start the appendicular skeleton. And so we're going to split the appendicular skeleton into your shoulder girdles and upper limbs, and then we're going to cover the pelvic girdle and lower limbs. The appendicular skeleton is actually composed of 126 bones. They include our limbs/appendages, our pectoral girdle, also called our shoulder girdle, and then our pelvic girdle. One thing to note about these two girdles is that they attach your limbs to your axial skeleton. So if we're looking here, our axial skeleton is in blue, and then everything that is this yellow color is going to be considered our appendicular skeleton. Again, here is a backside. First, we're going to focus on bones of the shoulder girdle. Again, this is also called the pectoral girdle. It is composed of two bones that attach the upper limb to the axial skeleton, and those two bones are the clavicle and scapula. One thing to know about the shoulder girdle is that it is very light and it is poorly reinforced. And the reason for this is actually to allow our upper limb to have a lot of flexibility. The two bones, like we said, we have the clavicle, which we'll know is commonly called the collarbone, and then the scapula, right here, we commonly call the shoulder blades. The clavicle, called the collarbones, are slender, doubly curved bones. They attach to the manubrium or the manubrium of the sternum. Again, this is just one of those bones that make up the sternum, and it attaches to the sternum medially, so towards the middle, and then to the scapula laterally or to the sides. It acts as a brace to hold the arm away from the top of the thorax and also helps prevent shoulder dislocation. When broken, whole shoulder region caves medially or caves inwards. So again, it is this long, it's doubly curved, so we see one curve here and the other curve here. This end right here is where it's going to attach to the sternum on the inside or medial side. On the lateral side, this is where it attaches to the scapula, and it attaches at a point called the acromial. Here is where we see it actually being attached to the sternum or the manubrium of the sternum. Then over here, we see it attached to the scapula at the acromioclavicular joint. The scapula is called the shoulder blades, or sometimes they're called wings because they flare out when we move our arms posteriorly or behind us. These are not directly attached to the axial skeleton in any way. They are just kind of loosely held in place by trunk muscles. There are important bone markings that we're going to see, and I do expect you guys to know these for the test. The first one is called the glenoid cavity. This is a very important bone marking because this is actually a socket that actually gets the head of your arm bone or your humerus. In other words, this is where your humerus attaches to your shoulder blade or your shoulder joint. There are also two other important bone markings, and these are processes. That means they stick out from the bone. The first one we have mentioned briefly. This is the acromion. This is the enlarged lateral end of the spine of the scapula. This is where the scapula and the clavicle join together. It forms something called the acromioclavicular joint. The second important thing is the coracoid process. This is the point. This points laterally over the top of the shoulder and essentially is a point where we anchor some of our muscles in our arm. So if we look at our scapula, again, we have the glenoid cavity, which it's hard to see on this side, but this is what gets our humerus. The acromion, where we attach to our clavicle, and then your coracoid process, this is where a lot of muscles attach. Here is a front view because it gives you a better view of where your humerus is going to attach into, or your arm bone. And then again, your acromion, where your shoulder or your collarbone attaches. One thing to know about your shoulder girdle is that it is, like I said, very light and poorly enforced. It does give us exceptional flexibility for three main reasons. One, it only attaches to the axial skeleton at one point, where the sternum of your axial skeleton meets your clavicle at the sternoclavicular joint. It also has very loose attachment to the scapula because just muscles kind of hold it in place, and so it can slide back and forth. The other thing is the glenoid cavity, where your arm bone meets your shoulder, is very shallow and it doesn't have a lot of ligaments holding it in place. So we do get a lot of flexibility. The only drawback to that flexibility, though, is that it's very easy to dislocate your shoulder. Next, we're going to talk about the bones of the upper limbs, so the upper part of your arm. There are 30 separate bones form the skeletal framework of each upper limb, and this is going to include your arm, your forearm, and your hands. So for upper arms, this is going to be formed from a single long bone that we call the humerus. It articulates at both the proximal and distal end. So articulate, this just means where does it join? So join. When I say proximal end, I'm talking near the shoulder. And when I say distal end, that means away. So this is going to be near our elbow. So at our shoulder, the rounded head of the humerus joins at the glenoid cavity of your scapula. At the distal end, this is near our elbow, the trochlea and the capitulum articulate with bones of the forearm, which is the ulna and radius. It contains several bone markings that allow for muscles and ligaments to attach, as well as nerve passageway. I do not expect you to know where these muscles and ligaments attach, just know that they do have these bone markings that allow that. Here's a picture of our humerus. We have the head of our humerus up here. Again, this attaches with our glenoid cavity. And then down here we have two processes that stick out that allows us to our upper arm to connect to our lower arm, the capitulum, and then our trochlea. Again, when I say there are a lot of bone markings, one of the example is the deltoid tuberosity. We have the greater and lesser tubercle, and the anatomical neck, which is actually easily the most broken part of a long bone. So these are different parts. Here is the front view. The forearm is composed of two bones. The first bone is the ulna and the second bone is the radius. The ulna is going to be considered the medial bone when you are standing in anatomical position. So what I mean by anatomical position means you're standing upright, arms to the side, palms facing forward, thumbs out. Medial bone is going to be the one towards the middle. This bone is going to also attach to your little finger side, so your pinky finger. At the proximal end, the ulna actually articulates with the humerus. So again, when I say proximal end, I am going to be talking about the end closest to the elbow. It has two parts on it that articulate with the humerus or the upper arm. Those two parts are the coronoid process and the olecranon. These articulate with the trochlear of the humerus. The second bone is the radius. We call this the lateral bones. Remember, lateral is to the sides. When I say radius, this is going to be the side where your thumb is located. Now with the radius, it also has to articulate with your humerus as well, your upper arm. And so at the elbow, your radius articulates or joins with your upper arm at a point called the capitulum. So the head of the radius and the capitulum of the humerus joins. So here we have two bones. First one, again, we have is the radius, is the thumb side. The ulna is the pinky side. One thing to note is the top of the ulna. This is where we're going to see our coronoid process and our olecranon. And then over here on our radius, we have the head. Again, it's going to attach to the humerus. The other thing to note about these two bones is that both proximally and distally, the radius and ulna articulate with one another at the radial ulnar joint. Also, along both of these bones, they connect to each other along their entire length with something called an interosseous membrane. And then again, this is very flexible. So I'm going to point up here. We have up here, these two bones meet right here at the proximal radial ulnar joint, again, where the radius and ulna join. They also do it distally down here, the radius and ulna join back up. Then along their entire length, they have something called interosseous membrane. The other thing to note about the ulna and radius is they both have something called a styloid process at the distal end, and this part allows it to attach to the bones in the wrist. Fun fact, when the hand is rotated so the palms are out of anatomical position and facing backwards, your radius and ulna actually cross over one another. Last, there is a location on the radius where we see a lot of tendons attached, specifically ones of the biceps muscles, and this is called the radial tuberosity. So if we look over here, if we bring those points back up, we do have a styloid process on the radial and the styloid process on the ulnar. This is where your hand bones are going to attach. Last but not least, we have our hands. Hands have several different bones in them. We have carpals, which are known as our wrist bones. So if you've ever heard the word of carpal tunnel for your wrist, it is composed of 8 bones arranged in 2 rows of 4 in each hand. After we have the carpal, we have the metacarpals. These are going to be the bones that you see in the palm of your hand. There are 5 per hand, and the head of these bones actually form your knuckles. Last but not least, you have your phalanges, which are your fingers and your thumb. There are 14 phalange bones in each hand, and that is because each of the fingers are composed of 3 bones, a proximal, middle, and distal end. But in the thumb, we actually have 2 bones. So 3 times 4 gives me 12, plus those 2 from the thumb. That's what gives me 14 bones in your fingers. Here we have a picture of our hand. We have our carpals, which are our wrist bones. I do not make you know each of the wrist bones individual bone names. If you take upper level A&P, they might require that. Then you have your metacarpals, like I said, are your palms. You got 5 here, and they form your knuckles. And then last but not least, you have your phalanges or fingers. The other thing I want you guys to know is note again, the radius and ulna have to attach to these wrist bones. And that is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask. And I hope you guys have a great day.